All right, this video lecture will continue to examine Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments and the theme of obedience as a moral problem. The motivation for the obedience experiments was the Holocaust of European Jews and the subsequent trial of Nazi leadership after the war. From 1933 to 1945, millions of innocent people were systematically slaughtered on command. Gas chambers were built, death camps were guarded, and daily quotas of corpses were produced with the same efficiency as the industrial manufacture of appliances. Now, these genocidal policies may have originated in the mind of a few horrible people, but the Holocaust could only have been carried out on a massive scale if ordinary people were obeying orders and doing their jobs in what amounted to an industry of genocide. Thousands and thousands of people whose job it was to guard the camps and drive the deportation trains, to maintain the railroads, to create and maintain census records of Jews, homosexuals, immigrants, and other minority groups, and to just coordinate and perform countless other logistical tasks. Similarly, German physicians participated in medical experiments on the interred Jews, and it was German doctors who determined who was fit to perform forced labor outside of the camps and who would instead be sent to the camps. Then there were the civil servants within governmental ministries and state departments who also played an essential role in the Holocaust. These are people who had jobs in the Ministry of Armaments, the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Justice, of Railroads, and of Foreign Affairs. So the point is, it wasn't merely the soldiers and the Gestapo and the SS, but it was also just the clerks, the paper pushers, and the other ordinary bureaucrats who were just, following orders, who were also essential in carrying out the Holocaust. The Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann was one of the major organizers of the Holocaust. He was tasked with overseeing and facilitating the mass deportation of Jews to the ghettos and then the extermination camps in Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe. And when he was brought to trial, Eichmann's defense was to say, I'm a soldier and I was just following orders. That was the defense and the justification of all of the Nazi leadership who weren't killed or who didn't kill themselves, but who were actually taken to trial. The philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote about the trial of Eichmann in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. And she found Eichmann to be an ordinary and rather bland bureaucrat who, in her words, was not perverted and not sadistic, but terrifyingly normal. And this is what she meant when she wrote that the greatest evil in the world is carried out by nobodies. And ordinary people, just like you and me, and your neighbors, and your friends, and your parents, we are all of us capable of this. We are capable of becoming complicit in genocide. And that's the insight that we need to take from the Holocaust. The true horror of the Holocaust is that any one of us could have been well adjusted to fascism, totalitarianism, and then became obedient in the face of such a horrendous event as the Holocaust. Now, Milgram, he wants to explain this. He wants to understand the psychology of obedience that transformed normal people into widgets and cogs of industrialized genocide. And he wants to know whether ordinary Americans would have also demonstrated that mass obedience and complicity demonstrated by ordinary German citizens in the 1930s. And he interprets the results of his obedience experiments as a clear demonstration that, yes, ordinary Americans were just as likely as the Germans to obey orders that they knew would result in the horrible suffering of others. Now, clearly there are differences between Milgram's sort of obedience laboratory and the Holocaust. But Milgram argues that the differences are relatively unimportant, writing, "The question arises as to whether there is any connection between what we have studied in the laboratory and the forms of obedience we so deplored in the Nazi epoch. The differences in the two situations are, of course, enormous, yet the difference in scale and in numbers and political context may turn out to be relatively unimportant as long as certain essential features are retained. Namely, that feature of a person coming to view himself as the instrument for carrying out another person's wishes and therefore no longer regarding himself as responsible for his actions. This fundamental feature, this is the agentic state that we discussed last lecture. Now, when it comes to the question of cruelty, like did the laboratory environment make the test subjects cruel, Milgram points out that this was not at all the case. In fact, he describes one subject like this. I observed a mature and initially poised businessman enter the lab smiling and confident. Within 20 minutes, he was reduced to a wreck, rapidly approaching a point of nervous collapse. He constantly pulled on his earlobe and twisted his hands. At one point, he pushed his fist into his forehead and muttered, "Oh God, let's stop it." And yet, he continued to respond to every word of the experimenter and obeyed until the very end. So just think, if an anonymous leader of an experiment, wearing a white lab coat and holding a notepad, can successfully order people to meekly follow orders with which they would normally disagree, then what can the government force its subjects to do when it's backed up by the enormous power of state authority? Also, consider what Milgram says about this phenomenon of politeness demonstrated by many of the test subjects. He states, "Finally, the language employed by the participant is revealing. Despite the considerable tension of the situation, a tone of courtesy is meticulously maintained. The subject's objections strike us as inordinately weak and inappropriate in view of the events in which he is immersed. He thinks he is killing someone, yet he uses the language of the tea table." So what is it that kept the test subject obedient and sort of locked in to the agentic state? Well, Milgram first identifies what he calls a few binding factors, and they include factors such as the politeness on the subject's part just discussed, right? This sort of strong reluctance to be disagreeable, in other words. But another binding factor was also just the desire to uphold their initial promise to aid the experimenter in this, memory study. And, on this point, remember that the subject, just a sort of ordinary working class person, believes they are participating in a study conducted by scientists from Yale University, a prestigious institution backed up with the social and cultural power of the Ivy League schools. And this expert who's running the experiment has, reassured you that they are responsible for what happens, and they keep reassuring you that the shocks will not do any permanent damage. So who are you to disagree with these scientists from Yale about how to conduct experiments? I mean, do you think you know better than the experts at Yale? Those are the types of thoughts that are going to be running through the test subject's head. And in fact, we know that when the experiment was repeated, it oftentimes, in different variations, told the test subjects that they weren't from Yale, but just from some other public state university, or maybe from like a community college, for instance. And then the experimenters lacked all of that cultural prestige that the original experiments had, and as a result, more people became willing to disobey the orders from the experimenter. Even some variations included replacing the wallpaper with wallpaper that was kind of crumbling, so it looked like there wasn't as much kind of money and therefore kind of power and prestige baked into the very environment. And that also, small little adjustment to the situation, that also made the test subjects more likely to disagree. And then the third binding factor is sort of because of this other stuff, there's just this awkwardness of actually being able to withdraw oneself from the experiment. It requires tremendous confidence in your own moral judgment of the situation to override that voice in your head that's telling you, oh yeah, this is like Yale University doing a study. Who am I to actually go against what the experts are saying? And it takes then an additional kind of virtue, namely courage, to act on your moral judgment and then set yourself against the power of the authority figure. Secondly, Milgram calls attention to these different adjustments that take place in the consciousness of the test subject. Mental adjustments that undermine his ability to break with authority. And these adjustments help the subject maintain his working relationship with the experimenter and then sort of soften the ethical conflict that he's experiencing by delivering these shocks that eventually are labeled fatal electric shocks. And one such mechanism was the tendency of the individual to become so absorbed in the narrow technical aspects of the task that he was assigned that he sort of loses sight of its broader consequences. So Milgram writes how the test subjects would start reading the word pairs with exquisite articulation, making sure they enunciate every word very, very carefully and clearly, and then also flipping the switches with great caution and care, being kind of precious about how they do it. The idea being that the test subject sort of zoomed himself in to this fixation with the switches that he was told to flip and the words that he was told to read, and then he sets himself to performing his little tasks with great care, and all of this makes it easier for him to concentrate on the minutiae, but leave the broader concern with the ethical nature of the experiment to the experimenter. All right? He leaves those concerns about whether this is right or wrong, he leaves those concerns to the authority that he's serving. But the most common adjustment of thought is for the subject to see himself as not responsible for his own actions. He sees himself, Milgram writes, not as a person acting in any morally accountable way, but simply an agent of an external authority. And so after the experiments were conducted, there was a sort of post-interview with all of the test subjects when they were told, hey, this wasn't an actual study on the effects of pain on memory. This is what the study was about. Why did you keep delivering the shocks? And the test subjects repeatedly say, well, I wouldn't have done it by myself. I was just doing what I was told. Milgram writes, the disappearance of a sense of responsibility is the most far-reaching consequence of a submission to authority. And we always want to reflect on the fact that the test subject is receiving not just one kind of command. He's always receiving two commands, right? He's receiving an order from the experimenter that says the experiment must continue. But he's also receiving a command from the victim in the other room who is commanding him to stop and to let him out of the experiment. And so there's a choice that's being made in the head of the test subject about who he will listen to, the authority, right, or the victim. And he listens to the authority. He does not listen to the victim and does not also listen to his own reason that's making a moral judgment about the unethical nature of the task that he is involved in. There's another really fascinating element that influenced the obedience of the test subject, and it's what Milgram calls a counter-anthropomorphism at work in the obedient experiments. Now, you're probably familiar with the idea of anthropomorphism. That's attributing personal or human qualities to an inanimate or non-human thing. So the opposite of that phenomenon would be a counter-anthropomorphism, meaning you are removing the presence of the person or the human from the situation. So Milgram, explaining this phenomenon, writes, some people treat systems of human origin as if they existed above and beyond any human agent, beyond the control of whim or of human feeling. In other words, counter-anthropomorphism occurs when the human element behind institutions or situations is erased. In this case, the human scientist who actually designed the experiment sort of disappears behind the experiment itself. And then the memory experiment sort of takes on this transcendent importance and significance. Milgram continues to unpack this idea, writing, when the experimenter says the experiment requires that you continue, The subject feels this to be an imperative that goes beyond any merely human command. And he does not ask the seemingly obvious question, which is, well, whose experiment? And why should the designer of the experiment be served while the victim suffers? The wishes of a man, namely the designer of the experiment, have become part of a schema which exerts on the subject's mind a force that transcends the personal. It's got to go on. It's got to go on, repeated one subject. Now, for another example of the counter-anthropomorphism, we can imagine the way that a very authoritarian and rigid professor might treat his or her class syllabus when discussing absences with a student who's facing an emergency. We can imagine the professor telling the student, look, I understand you've got extenuating circumstances, but the attendance policy is the policy. Students must be in compliance with the syllabus. It's out of my control. The syllabus must be obeyed, right? That's a sort of counter-anthropomorphism because it's disappearing the human element, which is the fact that the syllabus just doesn't exist in and of itself as some holy document that we are bound to. The syllabus was written by a person, the professor, who can be negotiated with, and there can be exceptions that are made in light of extenuating circumstances. 9.9 out of 10 professors would never say something like this, but that's just an example of something inhuman, the syllabus, right, taking on this sort of power by disappearing the fact that it's not actually inhuman. It's the product of a human being, namely the professor. A lot of students that I've had in class, when they are reflecting on the obedience experiments, they kind of comment that, well, these were taking place back in the 1960s, and people just were more obedient to authority back then than they are now. So I think my generation would be much more likely to disobey the experimenter. And, for one, I'm just not at all certain that's the case. You look back at the 60s, this was a countercultural era. We had the Black freedom struggle and the civil rights movement. We also had the anti-war movement and the free speech movement. Students are taking over campuses. People are rebelling and protesting in the streets, and they're throwing off the sort of moral puritanism of the 1950s. But, we don't have to have any empirical data about whether or not that generation was more or less obedient than current generations. We can actually just look at instances where this experiment has been repeated. A group of Polish scientists repeated the experiment in 2015. They found almost identical results to Milgram's original 1960 study. And they wrote that in terms of how society has changed, half a century after Milgram's original research into obedience to authority, a striking majority of subjects are still willing to electrocute a helpless individual. But also in 2006, Darren Brown, an English performer, illusionist, he also repeated Milgram's obedience experiments and found that they produced almost identical results.
That's wrong. 225 volts.
Ow! Take it off! I've had enough of this!
He's in a lot of pain,
Continue, please.
but he's not comfortable.
We must continue to the end of the experiment. Whether the learner likes it or not, he has to go on until he's learnt the words correctly.
Okay. Forest. That's wrong. 240 volts. Are you sure this is not causing any lasting damage? He sounds like he's in a lot of pain.
Well, the shocks might be painful, they're not harmful.
What does that mean, though? They're not harmful. Sorry, I'm not getting you. When you say that they might be painful but not harmful,
They cause no long-term damage.
okay, so what does that mean? That it doesn't leave any scars?
It causes no damage.
That seems very cold and calculated to me. This doesn't seem like a very. Anyway, Golden. That's wrong, mate. 300 volts.
No! That's enough! I refuse to answer anymore! Just let me out!
Staple. The options are diet, jar, balcony, and bowl.
If the learner doesn't answer in a reasonable time, say 4 to 5 seconds, then you have to treat the answer as wrong and follow that procedure.
Did you hear that, learner? Just any response, mate. Come on. Wild guess.
Please continue.
345 volts. If you're still with me, I'm sorry. I can't do this, honestly. Can we stop this experiment? Because I can't do this.
If you don't continue, we'll have to discontinue the experiment.
Yeah, okay, fine. That's fine. I'm not going to do this.
Incorrect. 405 volts. Sorry, I don't know. Is someone want to check on him or something? It's just he's not making any noise now, and he was before. And well, I'm quite happy to go on, but I just a bit worried about.
If you would continue.
Yeah, I'm just a bit worried because he was like he was like complaining before about the.
But no harm will come to him.
But he's not making any noise now.
It's essential that we continue with the experiment.
Balcony. Incorrect. 450 volts. You promise he's not. It won't.
Please continue with the procedure.
It hurts, but it's because it's like it says they're dangerous initial. We'll be alright. Yeah.
Please continue. Okay, I think we'll discontinue the experiment now.
All of the subjects were told the true nature of the experiment was to see how they would respond to authority, and that it would eventually form part of this show.
He is okay.
I can tell you, he's absolutely fine. You actually weren't administering electric shocks to him at all. He is.
In the original Milgram experiment, psychologists were asked to predict how many people would continue to the point that they were administering the highest shock on the board. Their prediction was 1/10%. They were wrong. The results of our experiment were almost identical to the original. Over 50% of participants continued up to 450 volts. The majority of people will administer lethal electric shocks just because a guy in a white coat is telling them to.
450 volts.
450 volts.
450 volts.
450.
All right, I want to close this lecture with a relevant quote from the historian Howard Zinn. Zinn writes, "Civil disobedience, that is not our problem. Our problem is civil obedience. Our problem is the number of people all over the world who have obeyed the dictates of the leaders of their government and who have gone to war. And millions have been killed because of this obedience. Our problem is that people are obedient all over the world in the face of poverty and starvation and stupidity and war and cruelty. Our problem is that people are obedient while the jails are full of petty thieves, and all the while the grand thieves are running the country. That's our problem." So the next section of class is going to deal with ethically relevant histories, and that will help prepare us for a discussion of the problem of disobedience, namely civil disobedience, by folks who refuse to obey the laws and the police in the context of the Black freedom struggle. All right, thanks.